Alldus podcast is brought to you by Alldus International, supplying your expert AI and digital transformation staffing needs across the US and Europe. Today, you are listening to our AI in Action series, where leading minds in AI from across the world share their story, success, and advice. AI in Action cuts through the hype and explores the true impact of artificial intelligence in our world today.
You're listening to AI in Action. I'm your host, JP Valentine. Our guest today is Sean Kamkar. Sean is the Vice President of Data Science at Zest AI. Sean, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, JP. Wonderful to be here.
That's our pleasure. So, Sean, let's start with a background of yourself. Can you give us a brief overview of your journey in technology, from where you got started, some of the roles you've held along the way, taking us up to today as the VP of Data Science for Zest?
I was the kid that really had to understand how everything worked. I remember trying to get my hands on anything I could, any sort of mechanical, electrical device, an old toaster, a busted TV, a broken console. And I remember even going dumpster diving to get my hands on whatever I could. And I remember as a kid, the thing that was really beautiful about all of that was once you opened up and you unlocked the device or whatever you were picking apart, you realized that at a lower level, all the components seemed to be so similar. And I thought the simplicity was so beautiful. And I knew at that moment, at a pretty early age, I just had to understand how that worked. And for me, math and physics seemed to be at, quite literally the center of the universe. So I went and studied that, went to undergrad. And I went in thinking I was going to create these grand unifying theories. And obviously that didn't happen. I ended feeling like I was just scratching the surface. I was lucky enough to have an internship that gave me sort of a window into a typical engineering desk job, and it terrified me. It felt routine, it felt ordinary, and it just didn't excite me. That's sort of the most important thing that I think we're all here on this planet to do. And so I went on to get my master's. And it felt like that surface area of stuff that I didn't understand just got bigger. So it's typical, the more the less. And so I went on to get my PhD, at which point I realized at the end of that, I didn't know much. But I also learned possibly an even more valuable lesson, which is that most people don't know much, and that you have generalists that know a lot about a little, specialists that know a lot about a few things. And so coming out of grad school, realizing that I wasn't going to sort of know it all in the context that I had set up, I was worried that I was going to be too deep and basically be irrelevant. I wasn't going to have any sort of real world impact. And so I did what probably a lot of people do in that position, was I stepped back from academia and I went into consulting. And I got a role working for a failure analysis company. And we did a lot of accident investigations. We did a lot of process remediation. And I worked in natural gas. And I had a wonderful time. I ended up managing and directing some of the largest natural gas programs in the United States. And while I knew that I was improving the safety for millions of customers, I did also feel like I was missing a really deep technical element. I was missing sort of the computational and the applied math that I've always loved. And so I did what probably a lot of folks, again, would do in that situation, was I took every single data science course I could get my hands on. And that was probably back in 2014. You had a number. It probably wasn't as much as what there are today. I interviewed at startups across LA. And just to sort of admit here to the listeners, that process took well over a year. And it was a really humbling experience. I think going into it, coming from a top tier, a graduate school, having solid experience on the consulting side, I figured I could just waltz into just about any startup. That was not the case. I kept hearing from most hiring managers the same line, which was, we think you're great, but we can't take the risk. You've never been in a startup before. You haven't been in, say, financial services. There's too much of a learning gap there. And so we can't afford that risk, Sean. We love you, but we can't say yes. And I'm happy to say that Zest did take that risk. 6 years ago, and it's paid off quite handsomely for me and them.
Sean, thank you for sharing that. I think that last point is such an important one because many candidates early on, whether they're making the transition from academia to industry or just starting out, will have been in the situation you were in. And it's great to hear you share about your experiences, as it's not unique, it's quite common. But if you persevere and stick with it, eventually you'll get on the run of the ladder, and then it goes from there. Which leads nicely now into where you're at today. So you obviously give some insight there. You've been with Zest for 6 years. You started as a entry level engineer. So why don't we start with a step back for everyone listening who's not familiar with Zest? Can you explain Zest AI as a business, who you are, what you do, the mission of the organization, and then talk us through your journey from when you started to now, the VP of the whole group?
Yeah, absolutely. Be happy to, JP. So Zest has always been on a mission to deliver fair and transparent credit to everyone. And we do that by building software that helps banks and other lenders effectively build more accurate credit risk models. And so when you have the ability to better understand your applicants, that means it's a win-win. And it's a win for lenders because you now have better economic outcomes. You're making more good loans and fewer bad ones. But it's also a big win for borrowers. This means having fairer access to credit. And something that I really think about, and I know it's something that really powers a lot of the people that are at Zest and really shapes how we think about problems, how we approach solutions, is that the unequal access to credit has perpetuated this economic inequalities in our system. And so, not to give people a grand history of where we got to from early days of creating credit to 2022, but essentially, I think people can realize that if you don't have a credit card or if you didn't get set up with credit early on in life, good luck taking out a loan. Good luck taking out a loan for a home mortgage. And home ownership is one of the most effective ways of building wealth. And so as we begin to think about not only building more powerful models, but building fairer models, we can really change the face of lending in America, but then also across the world.
So, Sean, you touched on it in your intro, how you joined Zest as it was a really early stage startup, and you've since stayed there for 6 years, which in the startup world is a very long time. Can you talk us through that journey, what it was like from when you first joined and as you grew, as the business grew into leadership roles and now obviously the VP of the whole group? What has the last 6 years been like? What were some of the milestones? What were the challenges early on? And as you look at the current iteration of the group, can you give us a sense of what the makeup is of the whole data team?
I came in with experience of managing massive teams, right? Hundreds of engineers, managing projects with budgets of tens of millions of dollars. And I realized pretty quickly that I was coming into Zest. They were taking a pretty big risk on me. And it was going to be rebuilding, learning what it means to be a modern professional software engineer. I had done a bunch of computational math back in grad school, but I had never built back-end systems before. And so there was a pretty steep learning curve. But the thing that always impressed me about Zest, and that's still true today, is just how patient everyone else is with their time. And that patience really pays off because I think at Zest, and I think a lot of companies, particularly startups, try to embody the sense of really searching for horsepower, really searching for folks that have the potential of growing into something great. And that's exactly where I was. And so when you look at that trajectory, it was first mastering software engineering, basic software engineering principles, and then furthering my progression along there. I think it was then only a matter of time, a couple years or so, that it was pretty clear that I had this really strong sort of numerical, mathematical, statistical background that I could then move into more data science-y kinds of problems. And it was there that I really started focusing on some of the things that we still at Zest hold very dear. And that is all of our fantastic technology and all of our IP around how to build better models, how to explain those models, and how to search for fairer alternatives. And looking at the growth and evolution of the team over time, the exciting thing is that a couple things have always stayed the same. So number one is the people. I think we've been very fortunate to create relatively academic and collegiate feel across the data science and technical teams, but not an academic in the sense of derogatory, of we can't get work done because we spend all day long in sort of an analysis paralysis, but we actually churn out high value, high impact. And there's also this really strong bond. I think I've never seen the case where one person is just charging up my idea, this is my work, but it's always a how can I help? How can I help other people? Is the general instinct that we see and that we really try to nurture. The second, as I've mentioned, is the IP. I think a lot of startups really try to play this balance between how do I work on just being customer centric? How do I work on building out my sales pipeline and delivering to customers? But then also, how do I maintain that bar and how do I keep pushing? And it's extremely competitive being in machine learning, being in AI, where you have not only a number of competitors out there, but you also have great work coming in from academia almost on a daily or weekly basis, where it feels like you can really leverage a lot of the learnings, a lot of the hard work from there back into your own business. And then lastly, the other thing that has been constant has been the kinds of problems that we get to solve. And so throughout my life, if you go back to academia, where the problems were very hard, technically and mathematically, the impact wasn't there relative. And then you look at consulting where the impact was tremendous, but I was solving these problems not maybe using rigorous math, rigorous statistics as much as I would have liked. This seems to be the perfect balance of those two needs of mine, which is, again, the deep technical leverage and also the direct impact on actual customers. And that has been really exciting. And as you said, 6 years at a startup, I feel like I've gone through several lifetimes in terms of how much I've learned, how much I've changed, and how much I've grown. And when you think about the business in terms of where we started and where we are today, I also think that evolution has kept me and fellow peers really engaged with what we do. And so that means that 10 years ago, 11 years ago, 12 years ago now, that when we started, we were a lender. We handled everything from customer acquisition, we ran marketing campaigns, we ran customer servicing. We also ran this little thing called credit underwriting in the middle of everything that required a lot of the heavy math, machine learning, and the AI, but we did everything else. And over time, we've pivoted to move entirely out of the lending business and just be a software company that sells software to banks so that they can build more powerful, more compliant, and more transparent models.
You are listening to the Alldus podcast. When you're looking to scale your team, or if you are interested in showcasing your company in a future episode, reach out today. Or if you're in the market for a new role, visit our website to view open positions, www.alldus.com.
When you look back on that change, obviously you guys have navigated successfully because the business has continued to grow. But what were some of the lessons that you learned during that change? And as you look back, is there anything that stands out to you as a particular proud moment?
That's a really great question, JP. And I think that sometimes you can claim that it was all part of your master plan or all part of the business's master plan. And that was obviously the thing that we were going along the entire way. And sometimes you get just a little bit of good fortune. And the nice thing about our journey of moving from lender to software business is all of the learnings that we picked up, all of the really detailed, nuanced challenges that you deal with from being in a heavily regulated environment like finance in America, all of the challenges that you deal with in terms of the fact on many credit products, you're making these decisions and you won't actually have data on whether or not that loan was good until a year out, 2 years out, maybe if you're dealing with mortgages, 30 years out. Those are really hard problems. And it's not just something where you can pick up a book or read a journal article and feel like you have the full understanding of just how hard and where the nuances are and where the blind spots are. But you have to live it. You have to go through it, I think, to really build out a solution that works for some of the largest financial institutions in the country. And working with some of our partners like Freddie Mac, obviously one of the largest underwriters of mortgages in the United States, certainly in the world, Discover Financial Services. Probably a lot of listeners may have open up their wallet, they may pull out a Discover card. Working with some of these very large customers, particularly early on in our migration or in our evolution from lender to software company, really forced us to think about some of the hardest challenges. And it wasn't about scale back then. It was about sort of the frontier of how hard, how far you could push the technology so that it was still explainable, so that it was still rational, and so that it still got through the second line of validation, the third line of validation, government regulators, right? As I said before, in financial services, there are a number of very proper checks and balances to make sure that you're not putting the American financial system at risk. And so working, say, an example I can give is working with Freddie Mac, one of our favorite partners, is they pushed us very early on. They came to us with a fundamental problem where they were having trouble finding fair models. And just for broader context for all the listeners out there, what generally happens when you create a credit model is you have a modeling team. And this is generally for a bigger bank, but you have a modeling team. They go off, they build the best model they can. They obviously aren't going to use protected class information. You won't have whether or not a borrower or an applicant is Hispanic or whether or not they're female in the model. But you build that credit model off of real credit signals, your trade file and your inquiries, and then you take that model and you hand it over to another team. And the team, various names, but they generally check to make sure that the model is fair. And if it isn't, they try to find fairer alternatives. And the trouble is that when you move to machine learning, a lot of the techniques that worked for a logistic regression model, where you only have, say, 10 features in the model, and you can perform this exhaustive, what happens when I drop a feature? How much does the model get fairer? How much does the model drop in terms of performance? That may work in the old logistic regression framework, but as you move to machine learning, where now you have hundreds of variables, now the models are really making use of those interactions between the different variables, you need a totally different playbook. And we together built a cutting edge, industry leading solution that we've then been able to implement across the board, not only to help Freddie build some of the fairest models in production, but also help all of our other lenders, everything from top tier banks to local community banks, credit unions, take advantage of the same technology. And so looking at that, thinking about how we've really moved towards scale, not we started there and we figured it out, right? You got to solve the hard problems first before you can really scale.
Absolutely. And on the point of scale, you've been there, from almost the beginning, but you've played a pivotal role in growing and sustaining the team. When you're speaking to prospective candidates about Zest and the unique environment that you guys have built, what are some of the points that you make to candidates to get them excited about Zest over some of the other opportunities that they're considering?
Yeah, quite often people come in, they interview, we speak to them, and to no surprise, it often comes down to do I work for this small, exciting startup, or do I work for a little bit more of a larger, maybe more mature tech giant, right? That's one of the decision points that I hear pretty commonly. And my advice is, number one, it's always up to them, right? You got to go with what feels right, what you're comfortable with, different risk tolerances, but hopefully, most importantly, what excites you. And I think the exciting thing about working for a company like Zest is you come in and you're not going to be stuck in a division of a division of a division responsible for 0.0000001% of the overall product or the overall value that we're delivering. You will own a major facet our offering. And you will have a tremendous support system and mentorship system, because a lot of the information, a lot of the expertise that you gain in credit is developed over time. And so this isn't a drop you in the deep end and just expect you to swim. That would be crazy, not only for our business, but also not a great ramp up process. But it's really looking for those candidates that want to not only make and have a significant impact, but also own a tremendous amount of scope and learn and grow in ways that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to at those larger companies.
Final question from me, Sean. You're somewhat unique in the startup space, where you've stayed with one company for over 5 years, grown from entry-level IC to now a VP in senior leadership. Obviously, a lot of challenges along the way, but you guys have had some incredible success. As you look ahead, what are you most excited about for the next year or two?
We have been very delighted, very pleased with the success that we've had. We really have always built our business around one of the core company mottos, principles, is just customer first. And so when we think about the problems, when we think about the solutions, when we think about how we communicate results, it's always what is best for the customer. And so looking out ahead, I think it's really continuing to work with customers, figuring out how to deliver great results at scale, but still always realizing that even when you're working with a credit union, and we love credit unions, but in comparison to the Freddies and Discovers, if you just look at the assets, much smaller, but they still require the same kind of relationship, right? Where you help them realize that when we talk about AI and machine learning, if it's their first rodeo to this, we're not building a scary self-learning monster, but the models that we build are just as accessible as their 100-year-old traditions of working with logistic regression. And so I think it's just really continuing to build that message. There's a strong human and there's a strong customer element in that, because we don't scale unless our customers are fully on board with what we're selling. And secondly, always the motto of, with better math and more data, we've shown that we can safely increase profits, and lenders can continue to support underserved groups and safely grow their businesses. And so there's obviously a lot in there in terms of better models, more transparent results, fair ways of thinking about delivering decisions to customers. But those are the areas that I'm most excited about for the future.
Sean, thank you so much for coming on today and talking to us, explaining your own journey with Zest, the overview of the business, what makes you guys unique, the pivot strategically a few years ago, and how that's sort of allowed you guys to continue to grow and service your customers, and the environment and the team that you've built. It sounds amazing. I'm sure there's people listening now who would be very interested in potentially working with you guys in the future. So thank you again, Sean.
Thanks, JP.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Alldus Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. We are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and any Android podcast of choice. You can also head over to our website, www.alldus.com, to listen to more podcasts, view our open roles, and stay up to date with industry news. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more great episodes coming very soon.